What's up, Wyoming drummers? Ed Breazeale here from the University of Wyoming. Going to talk down this year's All-State Jazz Etude. First thing I want to mention is that most of the figures in this etude are written in superscript. And superscript is the form of notation where inside the staff you have the slash marks, and then above the staff where the stems pointed upward are the figures that you're looking to play. So what that implies is that you're going to keep some of your time-keeping instruments like your hi-hat, ride cymbal, the bass drum if it's feathering, going while you also play the figures that are written. So in probably most cases I play those figures in superscript in the snare drum, although once it gets down on the second staff system, I start playing a few of the figures in the bass drum. And that's because I don't really like playing the snare drum on counts 1 and 3 if I can avoid it. Those are just sort of typically counts where you hear the bass drum. So if I have a bunch of 1s and or 3s in a row, if I'm going to play those, I'll play them in the bass drum if I'm able. Okay, so the pro tip of the day is the transition from the second staff system into the third staff system, where you have the decrescendo on that dotted quarter. What I do is I can't really affect a decrescendo with a single note, but I take the shoulder of my stick, and as I crash the ride cymbal on that and a 3, I hold that shoulder on the ride cymbal, so it kind of mutes the crash nearly as soon as the crash sounds. And then to further augment kind of the effect of a decrescendo, I don't play count 1 on the cymbal. I'm going to come back in on count 2 of the 9th measure, third staff system, with the ride cymbal, and by both muting the cymbal crash and then not playing on count 1, I'm going to sort of overcompensate for that dynamic shift. And then I continue to crescendo throughout the 3rd and 4th measures of the 3rd staff system. In the 1st and 2nd measures of the 4th staff system, I stop playing the superscript figures on the snare drum, and then I actually set those up and play those accents on the bass drum before transitioning into the 3rd and 4th measures of that 4th staff system, where I'm playing those bass drum and cymbal crashes basically exactly as they're notated in the part. Okay, so moving forward throughout the remainder of the etude, I'd say the last thing worth mentioning is the final 2 measures of the first portion of the etude. Even though those figures are mainly in superscript, I actually play drum fills in and around those figures, and that's because it's the last 2 measures of the etude, and I want to have a little bit more of a dramatic finish to the etude than if those same figures occurred much earlier in the etude. The last thing I want to talk about is feathering the bass drum. I'm feathering throughout the bulk of this etude, and it is indeed a necessary skill that jazz drummers must possess. It needs to be done really quietly, and that's the most difficult part about feathering, is that it's performed much softer than we would normally play the bass drum. And one of the things that can help you out if your feathering is too loud is moving your foot further towards the bass drum head on the drum pedal. So further up the footboard, right? The footboard's slanting upward. So getting your toes as close to the chain as possible. If your bass drum's fairly well muffled, mine in the video isn't, but if it is fairly well muffled, you can bury the bass drum beater into the head, right? Meaning you can let it rest on the drum head in the interval between each note, and that can sometimes make your life easier. Since my bass drum's not muffled particularly heavily, then I have to let it rebound, and that's a little bit more challenging.
Here's too loud. Here's about the right volume. And here's the Etude. 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
So the best advice I can give you about the bossa nova portion of the Etude is to spend a bunch of practice time working on combinations of eighth note and quarter note rhythms in your left hand, while having the other three limbs play their timekeeping roles from a typical bossa nova pattern. So the ride cymbal being played in eighth notes, and the bass drum being on 1, the end of 2, 3, and the end of 4, and the hi-hat being on 2 and 4. And the more fluent you are with playing, any type of combination of eighths and quarters that you see, the more this Etude is simply going to be like an application of those skills. The only other notes I'd like to offer is to make sure that you differentiate between the left hand textures you choose when you're keeping time, so that the timekeeping voice of the left hand is a rim click, and then the figures are played on some sort of drum. I'm using mainly the snare drum. And then that you go ahead and in the fifth measure, the last eighth note of the measure is tied to a whole note. Make sure that you have some sort of sustain, so allow for something to take place to connotate that sustain that's going to be happening in the wind part and all liking. Okay, as always, hope these comments are helpful, and best of luck on your audition.